Curtin Radio in Perth.
20 minutes past midday, 26 degrees, and in the studio, a very popular segment with a very popular gentleman, Mr. Trevor Tough, Outback Grave Markers. G'day, Trev.
G'day, Jenny. Thanks for having us along.
Oh, it's always great to have you here. Not only do our listeners enjoy the stories that you've been able to put together, which we got to say, congratulations. There's no stone unturned. Mind you, that's a bit of an ironical thing to say when you turn over the stones to find these graves.
That's it.
That's fantastic. The photographs you just showed me is from a trip you did in November.
That's right.
Where did you go for those?
We went up the Gibb River Road to near Mount Broome, just to the western side of Mount Broome. And it was pretty rough going and great fun.
Well, I'm glad you're doing it and you tell us the stories. It is rugged out there. How is it that you found that there was an unmarked grave out there? Because it was right off the road.
Yeah, Sammy Lovell had been through there many years ago, probably in the 1960s or 70s, droving cattle. And he happened to be out there again a few years ago, and he went looking for the grave and he found it. Yeah.
Did he know that you were involved in this?
Oh, yes. We've been working with Sammy for 5 or 6 years now.
So he said, I think I know where there is a grave.
Well, he's just such a good bushman. He can imagine where they would be and where they would camp. So
it would have been someone that lost their life, and whilst they were camping out, they weren't near a town or anything.
Yeah, this fella shot himself out there in 1894.
Oh, my gosh. What would he have been out there doing?
Gold prospecting. They were after gold. Yeah.
So the road that you went on with your four-wheel drives, it wasn't.
There was no road.
Dare I say road? It wasn't a road. There were ditches. So many rocks on.
Yeah, rivers and cross rivers and.
You've got a good vehicle. You should do with the Leyland brothers.
No.
You should do a series. You actually had a bit of a mishap with your vehicle too.
Yeah, one of the vehicles. That's not my vehicle, but Alan Pigram, the Pigram brothers in Broome, are great singers.
Yes, I've heard of them.
And Alan was with us, and his father had been prospecting out there for many years, and he fell into a hole in the long grass, dropped one wheel in it. Oh, I thought he was going to roll over, but.
So you wouldn't want to be out there on your own, would you?
No.
Because you have to get pulled out by another vehicle.
You need other vehicles to pull. Yeah, I towed him out backwards on that one.
So when you're out there and you've got the nature all around you with the flies and the heat and the red dust, you don't care about that?
No,
obviously.
You're a lot safer there than you are
on the freeway?
With nutters.
I tend to agree with you there. Very much so. No, it's great that you can share these stories with us today. Let's get started, shall we? Because they're always very detailed. Tell us about Hugh Murray and where was this area?
Okay, well, this is more of a feel-good story than the usual tragic or sad ones. And Hughie Murray was born in 1836 in the north of Scotland. And he died at Lawless near the Agnew Township and Mine on the 14th of November 1929. At the time of his death, he had reached the respectable age of 93 years, so it's not often we tell you a story of a bloke who died of old age. And he had arrived in Australia when he was a young fella and took an active part in the goldfields in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. And then he came across to the west in 1892. And after a little bit of time in Southern Cross, he went to Kew and later joined the rush to Lake Carey. And from there, he returned to Lawless, where he resided from the early gold days until his death. And he has been identified with the East Murchison since 1892. And apparently at 90 years of age, he was still remarkably active.
Gosh. And
could read and write without the use of glasses. He was probably the oldest man on the northern goldfields at that time, and Hughie was highly respected and beloved by young and old, and he retained his mental faculties in a singular manner to the end. And he's buried in the Roman Catholic section A at Lawless Cemetery.
I wonder why he is such a healthy man. Incredible, isn't it? At that age, even today, that's a good earning.
He's probably like us.
Good earnings. Oh yeah, very similar. We've all got reading glasses. Oh, you haven't actually. Now tell us about John Scott.
Right, John was a contractor carrying out work under a contract with the Mines Department to erect an enormous steel chimney at the new State Battery about 4 miles from Sandstone. On the 21st of October 1908, a dreadful accident occurred, resulting in his death. It seems that Mr. Scott and about half a dozen workmen were engaged in hoisting to the perpendicular a 40-feet iron chimney stack, weighing about 3 tons, when by some means the stack moved from its base, striking him across the lower part of the body, crushing both thighs, his right hip and inflicting other injuries. The unfortunate man was released as speedily as possible, and Dr. Stead was immediately sent for. Meanwhile, everything possible was done for the injured man, who, however, was beyond medical aid, and he expired just after Dr. Stead arrived. The local newspaper reported that Mr. E.G. Mackenzie, who was the manager of the State Battery and the person supervising the erection of the new plant, made the necessary arrangements for his funeral. It's probably the least he could do, really.
Yeah, I think so, yes.
And a large number of friends followed the remains to their last resting place, and the Reverend T.C. Oldfield read the burial service with Mr. J.A. MacDonald, the undertaker, having charge of the mortuary arrangements.
And so you put a plaque on his grave?
We have, yes.
Yeah, isn't that wonderful? I wonder if he's got descendants here.
Probably would have.
You've found a few, haven't you? Tell us about Amy Harris.
Well, this is some story about a unfortunate family in the southwest, and Julie in our research team has been working on the folks buried in that. Actually, hasn't been working on the folks. She's been working on the stories.
Thank you for that.
Of the folks buried in West Arthur Shire, and she came across this family, the Harris family, and young Amy Harris died on or about the 13th of February 1882, aged 5, and she's buried alongside other members of the family on the family property, which is called Wyagin Spring at Arthur River. Her parents were Mary and William Harris, and they were married in Perth on the 10th of August 1853. It seems they had about 13 children.
Goodness.
Now, young Amy went missing on the 10th of February 1882, and although extensive searching was done, no trace could be found of the little girl. Months later, on the 9th of July, Police Constable Chipper received a report that the remains of the child, Amy, had been found in the bush about 3 miles from the Arthur River Bridge and about 100 yards from the road between Barron's property and the Tawonga Inn. The remains were collected and taken to the Mount Pleasant Inn. An inquest found that the child had died from starvation and exposure in the bush on or about the 13th of February. Now, this was not the first tragedy to strike the Harris family while living at the 131 Mile. 2 of their boys, who were twins, aged 3, drowned in a well. And at one time, as William Harris arrived home with his team and the children ran out as usual to meet him, one child slipped off the wagon and fell under the wheels, causing death.
Goodness.
Another of their daughters, aged 12 years, was burnt to death when her dress caught on fire. So these poor family lost 5 children. Imagine that.
That is absolutely horrific, isn't it?
And it seems the more we research, the more common this sort of story becomes.
Yeah. Hasty's grave.
Hasty's grave is a better story, and on many of the old Outback maps, a location is clearly marked as Hasty's grave, and it's shown to be well west of you and me and south of the old homesteads at Duthagunna.
Duthagunna, what a name.
They're great names, aren't they? So some research into just who Hasty was takes us to the story of Robert Austin, who was one of the primary explorers of the Australian outback. In 1854, which was very early days, Robert Austin led an expedition east and then north to the Murchison River. The journey was dogged by disasters, poisoned plants, thirst, and having one young member die of tetanus a week or so after a gun accident which had shattered his forearm and elbow. On August the 28th, 1854, Austin's diary reports, "We're getting the horses together early this morning. We resumed our journey towards our camp. At 10 a.m, 6 miles from the camp, I left Lightfoot, Jailer and Hasty on a patch of grass near pools of water that had formed since we passed here before. On reaching the camp, I found 7 of my strongest horses lying dead, namely Joker, Snake, Yusuf, Blackbird, Simon, Barber and Punch, and the other horses were in a very precarious way. Darcy was evidently on his last legs. Poor Punch got lockjaw and had to be shot."
Did they have poison? Were they poisoned?
Poison plants, yeah. The lockjaw one sounds like tetanus.
Oh dear, okay.
A patch of green grass at Farmers Flats was found 10 miles east, and all the horses were moved there excepting Hasty and Lightfoot, neither of which could travel. On the 31st of August, Austin returned to find Hasty in a hopeless state, and he had to shoot him. Hasty is referred to in Austin's diary as a well-bred and spirited horse, and Hasty's grave is marked on maps to this day.
A horse grave.
Yeah, and one of our fellas went out there looking for Hasty's grave and tried to find out who Hasty was, and it turned out to be a horse.
How did you find that out when it's not? I know I often ask you this. How do you know?
This was all revealed in. There's a book about all Austin's diaries.
Their diaries. Oh, okay. And so the name of the horse was Hasty. They could. So you put what Hasty the horse is buried here.
We haven't marked it.
You haven't got that one yet. Oh, that is incredible.
We're not into horses just yet.
That'll be next. Albert Edward Kilminster and family.
Yeah, this is quite a good story. It's and there's a bit of a sequel to it. But anyway, sometimes the story of an ordinary family gives us a look into past times. George William Kilminster was born in London in 1842, and he came to Australia, and in time he married a lady called Elizabeth Richardson in March 1863 at Paddington Square, New South Wales. They had 12 children, and we've got a photo of this Elizabeth Richardson, absolutely beautiful lady.
Did she look tired?
No, must have been before she had 12 kids, I think.
I think so.
The youngest of their kids was Errol Rutter Kilminster, and he was killed at Gallipoli on the 10th of May 1915, aged 25. Albert Edward Kilminster, the centre of this story, was their first son and third child. He was born on the 28th of November 1870 at Woollahra in New South Wales, and he married a lady called Ethel Mary Muddle in Sydney in 1899, and they had 3 girls, Minnie, Ida and Shirley. Albert moved his family to WA in 1910, working in Kalgoorlie, and he became one of the noisy secessionists who were pushing for WA to secede from Australia in those days.
They started back then, goodness.
And here they had the youngest child, a boy named Edward George, or Ted Kilminster. When the Kalgoorlie pipeline was being built, Albert became a cook at one of the construction camps. Later he opened a tobacconist shop in London Court in Perth, but the business failed. For many years he was a travelling salesman for, well, we called it Nestles in those days. Now it's Nestle.
Yeah.
So he would travel around selling their chocolate products. And he would travel by train with his samples right through the goldfields, visiting all the mining centres and shops. His wife Ethel died at the age of 67 in 1941. Albert finished his life living in the old mill cottage at the windmill in South Perth, and that cottage sadly was pulled down and not preserved with the mill. In his 70s, he had one leg amputated at the hip because of gangrene, but he continued to live alone and look after himself until he died peacefully a few weeks before his 80th birthday at the home of his daughter Shirley. It was the 18th of September 1950. His son Ted Kilminster had died on the 4th of December 1944 as a prisoner of war at the notorious Japanese prisoner of war camp at Sandakan in North Borneo. Ted had been a prisoner of war for 3 years after his unit, the 2nd 6th Field Park Engineers, were all captured on the Malayan Peninsula at the fall of Singapore. Shirley was my mother. Ted Kilminster, who died at Sandakan, was my uncle.
Oh, you're talking about you.
Yep. And Albert Edward Kilminster is my grandfather.
Oh my gosh.
The Australian government classified and hid the story of Sandakan for decades. So Ted's mum and dad and my mother all died not knowing what had become of him.
Goodness.
Mum occasionally would sadly say to me, well, perhaps Ted has lost his memory and one day he will walk in our door. The awful story of Sandakan and the infamous death march did not come to light until the late 1980s, when one of the survivors, Keith Bottrell, finally revealed the facts. 2,000 Australians and 800 British soldiers died there, and only 5 survived. So the humble and ordinary Kilminster family lost a son at Gallipoli in World War I and one at Sandakan in World War II, and they deserve to be remembered.
Oh, do they ever. That's amazing. Have you known this story for a long time?
Yes, since the late 1980s. In 1995, my wife and I went over there to Sandakan for a 50-year ceremony there. Yeah.
Did you leave a plaque or anything?
Yes, I left some flowers there.
My goodness.
And since then, this morning, I've tracked down Ian Kilminster, who it turns out is one of our long-distance relations. Never heard from him.
Well, there might be others listening at the moment.
I hope so, yeah.
Wouldn't that be great?
It's amazing, yeah.
Well, so Ted, who is your...
He was my uncle, my mother's younger brother.
Right. And you were obviously a very young child at the time.
He died before I was born.
Yeah,
but I can remember my grandfather, Albert Edward Kilminster. My earliest memory is visiting the old mill cottage. I think I was not quite 3.
I remember that there, the windmill and the cottage. Yeah. And that got torn down, the cottage. What a ridiculous thing.
Taken down, yeah.
Why was he living there, I wonder? Was it a residential?
He was renting it.
Oh, was it rental?
It was a place to live,
Oh, my gosh. To have gone to a war like that and been a prisoner of war,
awful.
We cannot even imagine, can we? And we get concerned about being isolated for a week.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah, we don't have anything to grizzle about nowadays.
It's incredible how you've been able to find this out about your family.
Yeah,
it's incredible. So
nice,
there might be other grandnieces and nephews or something out there.
Yeah, I found another family too, and a nice young lass answered the phone this morning. So
really,
we might have some more. Yeah.
Well, if anyone's going to track them down, you are. That's for sure. So watch out, Kilmisters. He's on the hunt. You're on the hunt. Look, we thank you so much for this year. You're going to have a break in January.
Yes.
A well-deserved break.
So all the best to you and your listeners for a safe and happy Christmas, and we'll chat again in February.
Can't wait. You have fabulous stories. You go to a lot of effort for us to share those stories, and we thank you.
Thank you.
And we're going to play Outback Graves. This is by your son-in-law?
Son-in-law, yeah.
Here it is.
Beneath red soil and spinifex, down winding western trails, lie many untold stories in unmarked outback graves. Tales of lonely travelers, hapless journeys unfulfilled, of folks who sought another life, their lifeblood harshly spilled. Some had died from natural causes, bad weather, despair and thirst. Some from misadventures or circumstances worse. They were pioneers of this country, people young and old, from different lands and cultures, best efforts not resolved.
Now their graves have gone unnoticed and the stories left unheard, till these modern day explorers spread their word about the people of this country, how they lived and how they died, to mark their final resting place where others may have cried.
If you travel through the outback, across winding western trails, look beneath the soil and spinifex at the freshly remarked graves. It is there you'll find the stories of the pioneers of old, of their struggles and their fortunes, no longer left untold.
Now their graves have been noticed and their stories have been heard. These modern day explorers have spread their word about the people of our country, how they lived and how they died, to mark the final resting place where others may have cried. They've marked the final resting place where others may have cried.
Beneath red soil and spinifex, along winding western trails, lie rich and vibrant stories, marked by friends of Outback Graves.